o'clock. Welcome. Happy Wednesday. Happy almost last week of school. Okay, so let's start with some introductions. My name is Britta McCormick, and I'm the middle level ELA education support person here at the SCDE for ELA standards. And I would love to know who we have with us today. So if in the chat you'd put your name, your district, and maybe something you're looking forward to for this summer. Hi, Tiffany. Oh, fun, playing golf. Key West. Reading a lot of books, yes. April, amen, sister. Resting. Oh, Gretchen says the same thing. And going to the beach. I know if you noticed, I have Casey Prince Harvey with me today, who is our secondary ELA education associate, and a whole lot of other things. But Mandy, who is usually with us, our elementary counterpart, is at the beach today. So we're jealous of her. She texted Casey and me a few minutes ago and said, passing the agency, waved at y'all. We're like, thanks. At the beach. Oh, goodness. So, all right. Well, welcome, everyone. It's so good to see you all. We do have a note catcher landing page for you today. Casey's going to put that link in the chat if you want to open it up, make a copy. It will have some links to some things we're going to do today, as well as at the very end, all the resources that I will mention today. So you definitely want to have that open. And just as a reminder, anything that we share in our webinar presentations, instructional resources, supports, they're just some of many examples. Curriculum is determined and selected at the local level, and instruction should be based on your student interest and need. In addition to what is shared today, be sure to consult your high-quality instructional materials for resources and engagement to support students' learning. Okay, so because you are here live, you are going to get some recertification credit. We just ask that you stay for the duration of the webinar and then complete our feedback form at the end, participate as we go through these probably hours, 2 hours, and I will be getting those recertification credits to you via email. So our purpose today is to explore the research and evidence for bundling indicators to maximize instructional planning and delivery time, and then also to provide some instructional structures to support bundling indicators as you begin planning for next school year. Because here we are at the end of the year, and you guys are going to all go rest for like 2 weeks, and then you're going to put your teacher hats back on. But I just know that's how it is, right? And you're going to be thinking about what can we do better, what can we do differently, what do I need to think about for next school year. So that is the goal today, to kind of leave you with something to kind of ruminate on when you inevitably return back to thinking about school this summer. All right, so I have an article for you today, and I want you to read. It's very short, and it goes along with this image on the screen. It's about the three sisters. So just take a minute, read it. It's linked on box 1 of your note catcher. And then I want you to consider, what is the relevance of that article to today's work? Why would I have you read this particular article? So I'm going to give you just a few minutes. All right, if you'll take just a minute and in the chat, share what's coming to mind. What does this article have to do with a webinar on bundling indicators? Very good, Jessica. Thank you. Thinking about the way bundling indicators in a way that helps them all thrive. The natural ways they connect and support each other. Absolutely. Yes, Tiffany, it's going to save us time and help students develop competency at a deeper level. Absolutely. All indicators serve a purpose, whether it's the focus or the support. Love that. Very good. I'm so glad you found that connection. So a couple of things that I thought about as I was thinking about what to do as our kind of hook activity today was this particular story from when I taught elementary school about the three sisters. And so these three crops offered interdependence and support. And so just as they relied on each other to thrive, bundling indicators across a single strand, multiple strands, or across disciplines even really does create a network of support. So when you combine standards in thoughtful ways, each standard supports the others, providing a richer and more interconnected learning experience. There's also efficiency and purpose in that. I think it was Tiffany who said saving time, right? Just as planning three crops together is more efficient than planning them separately, bundling the indicators allows teachers to address multiple learning goals simultaneously. We're allowing students to engage with a variety of skills in one lesson or one unit rather than focusing on them in isolation, which ultimately is going to reduce redundancy and ensure that the time we are spending on them is productive and meaningful. And then finally, just balanced growth. These are not individual crops. They're a balanced system that nurtures that whole garden. And it's the same with bundling standards across subject areas. So ELA, social studies, or math and science. This encourages students to make connections across disciplines, which leads to a deeper, more complete understanding, which was another comment in the chat of just being able to take our students to a deeper level of understanding. So bundling isn't just about combining standards. It's about ensuring that each piece fits together in a way that strengthens the overall learning experience. And so that's really what I want us to take away from today is that as we are looking at how to bundle indicators across strands, within a strand, and across disciplines, that we're doing it with purpose, and that purpose is to strengthen the overall learning experience. So what you've done just now by reading that article, looking at maybe this piece of artwork here, very, very simple example of bringing in standards from several different disciplines. So you think about ELA grade 8, AOR 2.2, central idea within and across informational text. Why are you reading this informational text? What's the central idea? How does it cross concept? So thinking about what's the effect of getting all of these crops together? What's the effect of bundling our indicators? If I had asked you to take a look at this artwork and tell me the central idea and how it relates to maybe the text that you read, that's an anchor standard for your visual and performing art standards. And then there's actually Introduction to Agriculture course over in the CTE world that is for sixth graders, and that would fall within that course as well. So there is, if I was going to make a whole unit or a plan around just this particular article, there's a lot of ways that I could intentionally and purposefully pull in other disciplines. So just one example to get started. So we're going to start with the overview of bundling indicators, followed by some instructional structures and collaboration, and then we're going to close it up for today. So I want you to take a look at this description of bundling indicators and jot down any notes on your note catcher as you're thinking about it. What words or phrases are really jumping out and coming to your mind? Intentional. Experience, pairing, great. Intentional is like my very favorite word. I think that is probably one of the most important words for educators, that everything we do is on purpose and with a purpose. So some of the words or phrases that I pulled out are some of the same that you're doing. Intentional pairing, the standards, the strands, the disciplines. So this is what we're going to use as our working definition for bundling. The intentional pairing or connecting of indicators across standards, strands, or disciplines during an instructional experience, lesson, or unit. So my question for you now as we move forward is, what does intentional mean, and how can we ensure that we are being intentional? So just think on that for a second. And the other thing I want to make sure that we really say explicitly before moving on is that as we're bundling our indicators or expectations, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're teaching every single one of those expectations to mastery, right? Bundling indicators does not bypass targeted instruction for all indicators. So where we might be bundling them together so that indicators B, C, and D are support, A is our targeted instruction. And then you would need to still go back and do targeted instruction for B, C, and D. So we just want to make sure that's very clear, that just because we put a whole bunch together in one unit or one lesson, it doesn't necessarily mean we've taught it to mastery. And it's always something we want to come back to. So let's look for a minute at what do the standards say. So this is probably something you have seen before, but this is an excerpt from our standards document, page 20. And I'll give you a minute to read over this. So again, our standards document in the explanation of strands makes it very clear that the intent of our ELA standards is not to teach them in isolation, but to group and intentionally, there's that word again, teach indicators based on need and relevance. So in other words, not all indicators require a separate lesson, activity, or resource. Purposeful planning on the part of the teacher can yield effective and efficient results, and that's what we hope to explore today. All right, so pause and ponder. After that beginning, what is your understanding of the purpose of bundling indicators? And you can drop that in the chat, or you can unmute. What's the purpose? Deepen students' understanding, absolutely. Think more deeply about content, yes. Increase efficiency. Standards weren't meant to be taught in isolation. Help students make connections, absolutely. We want to reinforce and practice indicator expectations to support a very deep mastery of those expectations so that students can read, write, communicate while thinking critically and engaging with other students in an academic setting. So, to kind of show you what this looks like in our ELA standards, we have an excerpt here of AOR 5. You can see that this is the vertical articulation from Appendix B of our standards document. And we kind of just wanted to show you that bundling indicators will serve different purposes depending on the grade band and the level of instruction. And the vertical progression document is the easiest way to see that. So if you look at K5, if you've looked at our vertical articulation document, you know that words that are in bold are those new concepts for students at that year. So if you look K5, you're going to see a lot of bolded content, right? Kindergarten has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bolded words. So all of that's brand new to a kindergartner. But even when you go up to grade 4, there's still quite a few things that are bolded. So this shows us that new skills and content are frequently introduced K5. And when we bundle, it's to reinforce and practice that new learning. So anytime that students are introduced to something new, and then we can bring that back, I think someone said spiraling earlier in the comments, we can bring that back to continue to reinforce it. That's going to be a really strong purpose for bundling at the K5 level. However, as we move into middle and high school grades, you can see that the skills and content are less frequently introduced brand new. There's only one bold concept after 6th grade in this particular vertical articulation. However, the expectations increase in cognitive complexity. So where students were explaining or compare and contrast, we get into analysis, evaluation, critique. Those are much more cognitively complex. And so students would then use bundling, or teachers would use bundling to refine and then provide those real world connections that are going to allow them to reach that level of cognitive complexity that's expected within those indicators. So K-5 has its kind of purpose of just reinforcing and practicing. And then as middle school teachers and on to high school, our job is to bundle in a way that helps them refine skills and make connections to the real world. So let's look at some scenarios. There are three kind of ways that we're going to approach bundling. You can do that within an ELA strand. So maybe we take 2 or 3 indicators from AOR, right? Something like AOR 5.3 and AOR 4.1, and we teach those together. Or we can go across ELA strands. So perhaps AOR 5.3 and C.11. So communications along with our reading expectations. Or you could do between ELA and another discipline, or perhaps more than one discipline. So AOR 5.3, which again is that rhetoric indicator, and a social studies concept, 6.4.cc, which is the global exchanges, continuities changes, where they would analyze the progression of nationalism in the 19th through the early 20th century. So I chose to pair a rhetoric standard with that social studies standard because surely as people are trying to promote nationalism throughout the world, there's going to be some rhetoric involved there. So again, the 3 ways we can look within ELA, across, or a strand, across ELA strands, or between ELA and other content areas. It's also important to consider our overarching expectations because honestly, this is probably the easiest thing to bundle with every single content area because these are the skills and expectations that we should have at the forefront in every single classroom. So if you're looking at any of these 6 overarching expectations, think for a moment about a social studies classroom. Which one of these 6 immediately comes to mind in history, social studies? How could students use one of these overarching expectations? Thank you. Yeah, Queenie, all of them, right? Really, I could have said science, math, art, PE, health. It doesn't matter, right? Whatever it is, students should be doing these things in every classroom. Absolutely, Jessica. Looking at primary sources with overarching expectation too. So it's always, I think, a good starting place for our teachers when you're thinking about bundling indicators and they're like, that sounds like a lot, trying to find all these purposeful connections. What a great place to start with our overarching expectations. All right, so we looked at the 3 ways that we could bundle, and we're also going to look at kind of formats of bundling. Commonly, these are not the only ways you can do this, but it's the 3 we're going to look at today, where you can bundle through a theme or through a project or through a real world situation or problem. So think for a second about these 3 formats and decide, are any of them familiar? Have you experienced any of these? Any of them not feel familiar? You can jot notes on section 3 of your note catcher. You can put it in the chat or unmute about your initial thoughts about these 3 formats. Project-based learning, yep. Through a project most often, yeah, I agree with that. Thematic units, yes. Which we're going to talk about and how most of our high quality instructional materials, that's how they're organized, right? By those thematic units. So if we're not familiar with it, it's something that teachers are going to be familiar with as we really dig into the HQIM. And I think the real world situation problem tends to be one of the more difficult ones to do at large scale. But also, I think it oftentimes kind of is in line with that project as well. Like there's typically within a project something that a problem students are solving. So we're going to really dive into these three, and I'm going to give you examples of each three, and then you're going to work one out kind of on your own. But before we do that, another thing that we really just want to make very clear is that there's a difference between explicit instruction and then experiences for demonstrating understanding. Kind of going back to the comment I made earlier where just because you bundle doesn't mean you've taught every one of those indicators to mastery. That we can't bundle and give students a project and expect that to take the place of any explicit instruction that's needed. So explicit instruction, this is the teacher giving a direct explanation, instructions of skills and concepts. We are providing structure, guidance, ensuring objectives are met, addressing the learning needs, introducing new concepts, or providing targeted support. But if we look at experiences for demonstrating understanding, which oftentimes is what a project or a real world scenario type problem becomes, this is the student doing the work, right? Where they're giving us tasks, activities, projects to show that they're practicing skills or have developed skills or have mastered skills. This is a place for students to apply their learning, experiment with content and style, and get feedback from the teacher or their peers. And you want to use this to demonstrate the learning of skills taught during explicit instruction. So just know that any examples that we show you may have a mix of these. It may have a piece where the teacher has given the explicit instruction through that unit, and then the big project part is the demonstrating understanding part. So both parts are necessary. So we're going to do a virtual turn and talk in the chat. So for 30 seconds, I'm going to give you a prompt to respond to. Everybody will respond in the chat. And then after 30 seconds or after you've given your response, I want you to make a connection to someone else's chat. So you can just reply to them and give them feedback to what their response was. So your prompt is, what is the one piece of information from this section that you would take back to your school or district to share? So everybody give their initial response. All right, so as we've got some responses in the chat, if you'll go back to one of your peers and leave them a reply. I saw a request for an example, and I've got one coming. Excellent. All right, so let's get into the good stuff, what you want to see, right? Some instructional practices, some collaborative pieces, okay, what can I do with this? All right, so the first format that we talked about were themes. So this is an excerpt from one of our high quality instructional materials. But I could have picked any of them, right, across the state, and all of them are organized by theme. So this is the kind of unit overview where you can see Unit 1 is crossing generations, Unit 2, imagining the future, transformations, learning from nature, facing adversity. So thematic units use a theme to teach across multiple classroom disciplines. And, research shows us that the brain naturally looks for patterns and connections. So we're going to learn more effectively when our learning topics are not segmented, but they're grouped together and based on current knowledge. And that's going to help increase student motivation and academic achievement. So as middle school English teachers, this is going to be second nature to us. We often plan novel studies or units based on themes with these overarching essential questions. And then we're going to bundle the indicators in a way that supports the content and context of that unit. But I do know that even I often fell into the trap of maybe doing things because they were fun and they did fall into my theme, but they didn't necessarily align with indicators or standards. And that's where that intentional, purposeful planning comes into place. So we want to make sure that as students create, or excuse me, teachers create their own thematic units or use the ones that are in their high quality instructional materials, that they are bundling in a way that is purposeful. So an example I pulled from this same HQIM, and I actually pulled it from Unit 4, Learning from Nature. So in the upper left-hand corner is the text or a summary of the text from your high-quality instructional materials. This was a 7th grade textbook, Relationship Between Nature and People, and it is an informational text about the boy who used a windmill to bring electricity to his nation. So that I put together with an article from National Geographic, which had some really great maps in it about using wind energy and what parts of our world use it and how often they use it. And then I thought through, okay, well, how could I pull science, social studies, and ELA together in a way that is purposeful? So really, in the ELA classroom, I'm looking at text structures and text features. What have these authors of the National Geographic article and the excerpt from the text included in their writing that's going to really help me understand the author's purpose for these informational texts? But while I'm doing that, we're also thinking about geography skills, progressions, mapping, models, and representation, and why did we use this particular map versus another particular map? We're also thinking about energy, which is from our science, 7th grade science indicators, and thinking about how kinetic energy of an object changes and transfers to another object. And then, of course, we could have picked any of the overarching expectations, but this specifically, I picked overarching expectation 2. And so as I'm reading this text from my HQIM and I'm pulling in supporting articles from other sources, these are all of the things that I could intentionally teach or work together with my science and social studies teachers for them to navigate as well. So this is one example of pulling from our HQIM and then adding additional support and resources. So my question for you is just thinking about thematic bundling. What are some benefits, but also what considerations need to be made? Where is it that teachers can maybe stumble or there might be hurdles for them? And you can unmute or put that in the chat.
I think one thing that can be kind of tricky is like making sure you are still explicitly teaching certain indicators, because I think sometimes you can fall into picking things that are related to the theme first and not necessarily related to a particular skill that you want to be teaching. And I also think too, sometimes teachers can pick a lot. Even with like our textbooks, like we have Study Sync at my school and the unit is thematic, but I think the first unit has like 13 indicators in it. And if you're trying to explicitly teach 13 indicators in like 6 weeks, that's like, especially for middle school kids who need a lot of practice, you can sometimes put the theme ahead of mastering the skills. And I think that's a really fine line for teachers and something to really coach them to making sure they're keeping at the forefront of their brain.
Absolutely. And that's such a good point, Jessica. And when you take a look at this one, what I would explicitly teach here are text structures and text features, right? Like, what is the author's purpose? How do we know that based on what the authors have included in these articles? And I would be supporting or reteaching or practicing or refining energy, geography, those types of skills. And I think that's so important to point out, that there really does need to be that anchor of explicit instruction, and then everything else is the support. And I even would think about like, so the everything else could be intentionally chosen as either I've already taught this and I'm just looping it back in, or I'm introducing you to something that we're gonna learn. So pay attention to this over here. We're gonna come back to that later. Yes, very good. And some other things, yes, benefits, seeing those connections, working on pacing, not being overwhelmed, really aware with students' progress and learning the skills. Absolutely. So our second kind of idea or format was the project and the project-based learning. So this is something I'm sure you've all heard of. It's a teaching method in which students gain knowledge and skills by working for an extended period of time to investigate and respond to an authentic, engaging, and complex question, problem, or challenge. So what I'm going to show you, this example is actually something I did in my 6th grade intervention classroom. And I used my entire team. So I taught ELA, and then there was a math teacher, a science teacher, and a social studies teacher. And we did this whole project together as a team over a series of weeks. So they were asked to research and complete an inquiry project based on the theme of survival. So you can see it's kind of a little bit of theme brought in, a little bit of problem, and then that project-based learning. So every student received a scenario. They were all different, and they were challenged to create a plan for survival within that scenario. Completed portions of the project in all their classes. And then at the very end, we went to survival school on a field trip. We went out into the woods and learned how to survive. So this particular example that you see on the screen would be they were hiking in Central America in the Amazon River Basin. They got lost. Here's what they had with them. How are you going to survive? So we required several things from students in this project. We asked that they do an inquiry project that included a description of their location with visual aids, explaining the climate, the native animals, the plants, the possible dangers, how they might come up with solutions to those. They had to do a survival plan that included how they're going to find food, water, and shelter. And food and water were completed in social studies class because at the time that went along with the 6th grade social studies standards for hunters and gatherers, right? They also had to think through their shelter. That was done in math class where they created a blueprint plan with actual measurements and scale measurements, because at the time, the math standards included scales scale measurements for 6th grade. And they had to consider they could only use the materials or tools that they could be found in that natural environment or their survival scenario. And then they had to create a simple machine in science, because at the time, the science standards in 6th grade were simple machines. And they had to create a blueprint of their simple machine, and then they also had to physically build their simple machine. And then they also had to do diary entries, at least 3, that detailed important events that happened to them during their survival. That brought in the narrative piece, and then they had to present this survival plan to their peers and some guests that we invited into the room. So here, this is just some pictures of them at survival school. Was a really cool experience. And then you can see here we have one of our simple machines where they've got the wheel or the fulcrum, and the bunny rabbit they're trying to bait into their fire in their boiling pot. But here's how kind of that breakdown went. Obviously, they were using research skills. I think research is probably the easiest of the strands to incorporate through every other strand, where they were using those critical thinking skills to investigate, evaluate, synthesize a variety of sources to obtain and refine knowledge. That is when they were doing their research. Their informative writing, where they had to examine a topic and analyze information from one or more sources. That was the inquiry project or the presentation they had to do. They also were writing narratives with their diary entries, communicating ideas by presenting their information orally. They compared the development of social systems among the early river valley civilizations. So again, the hunters and gatherers. science and engineering practices with their simple machines. And then in math, the solving mathematical and real world situations with dimensions and areas of geometric features, including scale drawings and scale factors. So they developed those blueprints and scale and real measurements. So that was a huge project, and it was really neat to see it all culminate and come together. But a really effective and interesting way for them to pull pieces of each of their content areas into one. So just one example of what a project might look like. And so I'm going to ask you the same question. What are the benefits of bundling through project-based learning, and what considerations need to be made? Yes, Jessica, very engaging. Kids were into that. Queenie, yes, it had to be, the long range plan was very important, getting all the teammates on board to participate and make sure it all lined up within their particular long range plans was important. Absolutely, Tiffany. Making sure that we're doing standards aligned and not just fun, standards adjacent, maybe. Yes, blends a lot of moving parts. So it takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of buy-in. And if I was working with teachers to do this, I might pick a model team to try it first and have them do it once, not every single unit throughout the year, right? We didn't continue to do these huge, large-scale PBLs every single time we were teaching something. That's just not realistic, right? So picking a group of teachers you think can knock it out of the park, be a great example, asking them to do one, sitting beside them and planning through it and considering, when can we do this? What needs to be included is a great way, I think, to really get other teachers interested in what that could look like and how it can be done. Yes, I agree. The challenge is planning in a way that sufficiently addresses the indicators and standards. Yep, absolutely. And each one of the teachers here all had to have some form of explicit instruction before students could then demonstrate this understanding. We didn't ask them to think about how to hunt and gather food in the wilderness before the social studies teacher had taught what that even means, right? We didn't ask them to build a simple machine before their science teacher had explicitly taught simple machines. So, okay. So the last one is through a real world situation or problem. So this is another actual scenario from my classroom, but it was from when I was teaching elementary school, but it'll still relate. So I had a problem that I wanted to communicate with parents each week, but I did not have time for that. I didn't have time every single week to sit down and send out a lengthy, here's what we're doing in the classroom. So what can I do? And I asked my students, because really I wanted them to take some ownership over keeping their parents informed, but also summarizing, reviewing what we had done for the week. So my students came up with a KidCast, or like a podcast, where they had a weekly student written, recorded, and produced podcast. They enjoyed it, and I was able to get lots of skills practice and reinforcement, and even some explicit instruction in certain areas through their KidCast. So here are some of the standards that, even though I did this in 5th grade, I kind of moved it up and aligned it with 6th grade since we're all middle school here today. So communicating ideas, presenting information orally to report on a topic or text. So they did record weekly oral presentations. Now, granted, if you were going to do this in the classroom, how I did it, not every student did this every single week. They were in teams, and like week 1 was team A, week 2 was team B, and they kind of rotated. We did informative or expository writing, where they had to write their scripts for the weekly podcast, summarizing and paraphrasing, which is a hugely important skill, particularly in middle school, where we're starting to paraphrase for the first time. So they were asked to summarize their learning for the week to incorporate into a segment of the podcast. Collaboration and perspective, where we're engaging in structured conversations. That's exactly what a podcast is. Students worked in teams to write and record that. There was also digital literacy brought in here, using software applications to collaborate and create authentic products. So they had to learn how to record and edit and then publish this podcast. And then just one anchor standard from visual art, I had them also create the album cover for the KidCast. So when you looked on iTunes to find our podcast, that was the picture that showed up, is one that they created and then voted on as a class to which one would represent our classroom podcast. So again, here's a real world problem. Your teacher needs a way to communicate with parents every week, solve that problem, and that is what they developed. So ask that same question for the final time. What are the benefits and what are considerations need to be made when thinking through problems and solutions or situations? Love that, Gretchen, that it's highly engaging because the students are considered part of the process. Yeah. Christy, that's a great point too. Who's going to get the credit when it's a group type project? Everyone needs a responsibility, incorporating some sort of peer assessment in there. Another thing is, particularly as students get older, is if you allowed them to pick their own problems, making sure that those stay school friendly, and that it's something that we can actually appropriately solve or put an answer on in the classroom. And also, I think the piece that makes this really important is the authenticity piece, that, okay, so this is just a random problem. You want me to solve it, but that's never going to go anywhere. I can write a letter to my principal. I can write a letter to the president, but I'm never actually going to make an impact. So choosing problems, real world situations that they can see that they actually solved, they actually fixed, or they actually made a difference, I think is a consideration when bundling and planning in this particular way for it to be effective. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. In a moment, Casey is going to put you into 3 breakout rooms. And in the breakout rooms, you are going to decide on a grade level. I believe you have 9 options on section 4 of your note catcher. You have 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And with each one of those options, you have within an ELA strand, across an ELA strand, and between ELA and another discipline. I don't care which one your group chooses, but just choose quickly. So make a decision. And then open that document up and discuss the different indicators that have been bundled for you already. So you'll open it up. You'll see there are indicators that have been bundled for you. I'll open one up so you can see. If we have 8th grade between ELA and another discipline, for example, you'll make a copy. And it shows you that you've got a ELA research, informative and expository writing, as well as a science indicator. Your job as a group would be to look at these indicators and just think through, would this be easiest thematically, maybe project-based, maybe through a problem or a real-world situation. I want you to consider what overarching expectation would seamlessly enter into that, and then come up with your very basic, I'm not asking for a unit plan here, but very basic instructional idea, right? Again, you're only going to choose one of these 9, but you have all 9 of them so that if you're working through this practice with teachers, you're welcome to use any and all of those. And it also gives you a place to start when thinking about which indicators can I bundle together. Well, we've already bundled some for you, so it's a good starting point. So we're going to put you in your breakout rooms, maybe 12 to 15 minutes, decide in your group which one you're picking, and then you'll decide on an overarching expectation and an instructional idea for that. And be prepared when you come back to share what your group thought about. So somebody in your room needs to be the designated talker when we come back. Sound good? All right. All right. Welcome back. I am looking forward to hearing what you all were able to talk about. So whoever wants to go first, whoever your a designated person is, just wants to pop in and let us know what you worked on.
All right, we'll go first. And Christy had to step out for her meeting, but we'll share as a group, what we all talked about.
Okay.
So we clicked on the middle box on that chart, which was grade 7 bundling across ELA strands. And the main things that we needed to focus on were argument and rhetoric, argumentative writing, and communicating ideas. So we actually decided to try to make it real world, semi-authentic by going with a Newsela article. And the teacher could pick one that's aligned to the theme for the unit. But many of those articles, it's like a science or technology based news article. And then many of them also have like 2 sides to it or a problem to solve. Mm-hmm. So using that article, the students would develop an argument around the problem. And then to pull in an overarching expectation, we wanted to include collaboration so they could work together to develop this, but then their final product would need to be something of their own development so we could assess like what they understand about it. And Christy brought up that point as, a caution that we want to be able to know what each student can do. And then as a final product, we thought that a podcast might be good and they could stage it like a news program. And I believe it was Latrice that mentioned that we could bring in another standard that wasn't listed on our chart, but opposing viewpoints, so that the students could like argue those points on the podcast, but they would need to prepare a script ahead of time so they could include all their evidence for that.
I love that. Great job. Thank you, Tiffany. Another group?
I'll piggyback because ours was the same one. We were 7th grade, argumentative across strands.
Mm-hmm.
And y'all did a really good job. We didn't go that far. We were just trying to think real world problem. We totally pulled in the overarching expectation of citing evidence, and that they would create, we would give them informational text, maybe in a text set, about the prompt being when should school start time be. Mm-hmm. And so giving them some text that support, teens needing to sleep in, and text supporting starting early, just that variety, and having them write an argumentative paper. Now, we did mention another project with that after the fact, so we could do something that supports that communication and presentation, I should say, of what of their findings. I'd also like to incorporate like a survey that they could do with their schools. So that's kind of where we landed Did I miss
Yeah,
anything,
no, I
Coach?
love
Okay.
that. I love that idea of bringing in a survey too, and then that's data. They could add some tables or charts to their informational text they're writing. I love that, Queen. All right, my last group.
We talked about, we chose grade 7 and we did within the ELA strand. And we
That's so
talked
funny.
about, we added citing evidence to explain and justified reasoning, because we talked about having students either do a Socratic seminar or a fishbowl, giving them some, putting them in groups and giving them hot topics like traditional cars versus solar power cars, or cell phones in school or not, things that 7th graders would want to talk about.
Yeah.
And then using things like discussion stems to really dig into getting them to justify their reasoning, because they're always really passionate, but getting them to do that reasoning apart, and tying that to them having very clear reasons and relevant evidence. So putting those all together. And then maybe having them, each group put together some kind of presentation, whether that's an infographic that they present to the class, whether that's a PowerPoint, and that would take care of them, of course, in that process. Then they would have to, and they would figure that out. They would hit planning, editing, and all of those things, and getting feedback, them creating a rubric to get feedback from the other groups.
I love that. What are the odds? Somebody could probably do the math on that, really, that every group picked the same one, but I love that. And those are excellent ideas. And as you're talking and you're thinking, oh, you know what, we could do that also. We could add that also. I think that's the value in being able to come alongside other educators and really think through intentional planning and being purposeful. And I think somebody mentioned earlier that, sometimes, or I think it was Jessica, and her HYM unit 1 had 13 indicators, that sometimes we can get too many in there. So like having people who are beside us who can help us pare down what is the most bang for our buck, which ones, can we really focus on here? Which one's going to be my explicit teaching? Which ones are going to be our support or our practice or our refinement? And just making sure that again, we're planning with intention and purpose. So I appreciate those conversations, and I hope the additional bundling examples are something that you will be able to use with teachers that you're working with. So just as you're thinking through next steps, really quickly, if you want to jot down on box 5, or maybe this is something for you to just kind of think about as we're closing up today, how could you use bundling indicators to plan for next school year? And what are 2 ways that you can use this information just in the coming weeks and months? So as we're wrapping up the school year, what's kind of floating around in your head? Those are some things I want you to think on, but you don't have to share, because I do want you to share our final reflection, and that is the mirror microscope binoculars. And I'd like for you to choose one of these and respond in the chat, or you could unmute. So think your mirror, looking kind of at yourself, what misconceptions have been clarified or new learning was experienced. You could also do microscope. So what are you thinking that you still need to take a closer look at as it involves bundling indicators? And then the binoculars, you can look ahead. So how will information from today's session impact student learning? Or if you want to consider one of those next steps questions, how are you going to use this information looking forward? So just choose one, and we'll get those responses in the chat, or you can unmute. Love that, Jessica. Emily, great. So like we said at the beginning, as you're planning this summer, because teachers never really take a break, I see that you guys are going to consider how to really bundle standards and indicators as you're doing some curriculum planning this summer. And if there are any of you who have the opportunity to maybe get different content areas together on a day in that curriculum planning or whatever, I encourage you to do that and let us know how it goes. Let us know what you come up with. Absolutely, Lisa. It's digging into those indicators, seeing where they naturally overlap. Excellent, Queenie. Expanding on the examples. Yay. It's good to see that you're all looking forward to implementing something that you thought about today.